Okay, hello everyone. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And good afternoon. On behalf of Al-Aqsa University in Gaza and our English department, I'm really delighted to welcome you all to this webinar. It's such a great privilege to host uh, this special event. Even greater honor to welcome our esteemed guest, Professor Daniel Xerri. Professor Xerri is a highly respected academic, research, and advocate for educational development, particularly in the field of language education. He has published widely on professional development, research engagement, and student empowerment, and has really delivered talks and workshops around the world, both in person and online. Today's session is a really valuable opportunity for all of us to learn from, especially our students, to gain insights and ask questions and engage meaningfully with new perspectives and learn new things about research. Despite the distance, I believe this virtual space and opportunity will allow us to connect. And that's why it comes as part of Reconnect initiative. So it's going to connect us with global thought and leaders in the field like Professor Xerri and learn from his experience. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Xerri, and we are truly honored, Prof. Xerri, to have you with us today. Prof. Xerri, over to you.
Thank you, Ahmed, and good morning, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be. I'm truly honored to have been invited to address you today and to talk about small-scale research, which I believe is something highly valuable for people who will eventually become educators, and I believe that's the case with today's audience. So many of the things that I will be saying are applicable to teachers who are interested not only in engaging with research, that is, in reading about what's being published, what's being said about educational developments, but also in terms of doing research as a means of finding answers to their own questions, to the questions that they might have about what's happening in the classroom, and trying to unravel some of the complexity of the classroom. For those of you who have already done some teaching practice or who are highly interested in learning about the classroom, you're very much aware that the classroom is ultimately made up of people interacting with one another, and the dynamics of language learning ultimately make the classroom a highly complex environment. Research, when conducted by teachers, not only on their own, but sometimes in collaboration with the peers and with the students, is a means of understanding that complexity. But before I start talking about the process of doing research and some of the things that we need to bear in mind when we actually engage in research, I'd like to pose a very simple and basic question at the heart of it all. And that question is, what is research? So you are free to use the chat box and to try and try to share your own thoughts, your own conceptualizations of this particular term. Now, this is a problematic term for many people around the world, even within our own profession, English language teaching, because it leads to certain assumptions, certain beliefs, and those beliefs sometimes act as obstacles. They hinder people from actually finding the courage to engage in research. So feel free to use the chat box and briefly write what comes to mind when someone asks you this question, or when you pose this question to yourself. What is research? Let me give you some time to do that. I will also be monitoring the chat box, and I'd like to see your thoughts on this. So Ruba here has said systematic investigation to discover knowledge. And yes, when we look at many definitions of research, not only within education, but even in other disciplines, the word systematic keeps coming up. Research is described as a systematic process involving rigor. Okay, Mahmoud here is talking about collecting, analyzing, and interpreting information. Dana, research is what I look for in a topic in one place. Perhaps, if I'm understanding you correctly, research is also about understanding how we engage with other people's research. So when we talk of research engagement, we're not only merely talking about doing research, but at a very basic level, we also need to understand that teachers can also be research engaged by understanding where to look for information, how to determine which information is useful, trustworthy, and applicable to their own context. So research engagement has two dimensions to it. We engage with research, that is by reading it, by listening to it if we go to a conference, but also by doing it. So research, we engage in research. Good. I'm seeing Doas here. Definition, research is trying to find answers to questions, inputs, processes, outputs. Great. So these are all very useful answers to the question. And when we ask this question of teachers, it leads to different conceptions of research. The problem is that some of these conceptions are conceptions inherited from academics like myself and others. And the conceptions of research that operate within academia might not always be useful for those who are doing research within their own classroom. And certain qualities of research as used in academia are sometimes problematic for people within the language classroom because they lead them to conduct research which is, for example, described as objective. Now, objectivity is problematic if you want to do research in a context where relationships matter, where your own positionality as the researcher is something that cannot ultimately be disregarded. So the question can be interpreted and answered in multiple ways. But at the very heart of the research process, what we see is what Christine Kuhn describes as basically finding out something that we don't know. Trying to find answers to the questions that we have and learning something new about the classroom, about what we do as teachers, and about our students. So when we think of conceptions of research, we have to be very careful not to merely adopt the conceptions that are being used in academia and apply them to our work as language educators without criticality. We have to ultimately understand that research can be understood as broadly as possible, and that what we do as educators might not always be aligned with what happens when professional researchers or academics conduct research on the classroom. Even though there is a lot of value in the work of educational researchers who work in universities and research organizations, there's a lot of value in that because it helps us to understand language teaching and learning better. There is also a lot of value in the research endeavors of practitioners, and practitioners doing research in their classrooms systematically or less systematically, on their own or else in collaboration with their colleagues and with their learners. There is a lot of value in that. And it is knowledge co-construction that is happening there, which shouldn't be seen as being less important or of less quality than the research conducted by professional researchers. So let us not feel as if we are doing something that is not as valuable as the kind of research conducted by people working in university environments. Now, if we look at other definitions of research, we see that the word systematic, as some of you pointed out, is an important way of understanding this enterprise that we engage in when we actually do research. But research is ultimately a means by which we find answers to the questions that we have. And this means that at the very heart of the process, at the very beginning of the entire process, we need to focus on the right questions. We need to know how to ask appropriate questions. And that is why every research project, whether conducted by academics or by practitioners, it always starts from questions. And then, obviously, we describe these questions as research questions, and we'll be talking a bit about this later. Once we have come up with the right questions, we start thinking of the right way of answering the questions. And it is very important that we follow this particular sequence, because if we merely start thinking of the methods before we think of the research questions, then we are not going to choose the methods that are most appropriate for the questions that we want answers to. So that is why the questions are always at the very beginning of the process. Now, those questions might have been instigated by a problem that we've identified in our classroom, by a puzzle that we'd like to actually solve. Okay, and here I'm alluding to exploratory practice, or else other issues that we and our colleagues are facing in doing our work as language teachers. But once we have actually determined what questions we need to ask, then we can move on to the next stages of the research process. And once we identify the best way of looking for those answers, then we can actually come up with the answers. So there is a sequence, there is a series of steps that we need to follow. And today I will be briefly talking about how we can actually follow this process in a systematic manner in order for us as practitioners to be able to do research that is valuable for us, for our learners, for our colleagues, but not only, because the kind of research that practitioners do within the context, within the classroom, is not only valuable for their immediate community, but it is also a means by which they can contribute to the bigger conversations that we are having in our field, in ELT. And this is where, towards the end of this talk, I will also be looking at dissemination. Now, for the purposes of this talk, and given the fact that I've been told you're all working on articles for a special issue, I will be looking primarily at journals and journal articles. But there are many ways in which practitioners can share their knowledge with the immediate community that they belong to, with the broader ELT community, and with the rest of the world. Now, when we talk of research and teachers doing research, we have to understand that there is a very important notion that comes into play, and this is the idea of research literacy. So in order for us to be able to do research, we need to ultimately understand how research works. And research literacy refers to a number of different components. At the very basis of the entire process, we have our ability to engage with research, something that I've already talked about. And this means our understanding of where to find relevant research, how to evaluate it, and how to determine whether it's relevant and useful for us and for our students and for our colleagues. And ultimately, after we've understood that research, how can we apply it to our own professional context? So that is also part of research literacy. Research literacy is not only about understanding how to draft a questionnaire and how to analyze data, it's also about the critical skills required in order for you to look at all of the research that is being published on a constant basis and determine how you can make use of it in your own context and with your own community. So that is another important component of research literacy. Research literacy also involves something that I've touched upon, the idea that we don't narrow our understanding of research. We don't limit ourselves to looking at research only in the way that certain academics or certain schools of thought or certain research paradigms look at research. We don't understand research as only involving statistical data or quantitative methods, but we appreciate that research is broader than that.
محاضرة عن الريسيرش محاضرة عن how does it work اللي هو عن الريسيرش.
Sorry about that. Well,
no worries. There will be time for questions later on in the session. So broad conceptions of research are an important part of research literacy as well, as obviously are the technical knowledge and skills that we require in order for us to, for example, formulate an appropriate research question, draft research instruments, analyze data appropriately. So if we are doing interviews with our students in order for us to understand an issue that they might be facing with a particular assessment that is in place at our school, do we know how to analyze that interview data? Do we know how to do thematic analysis? So those are technical skills that we're talking about there, but let us not make the mistake of thinking that research literacy is only about technical skills or the knowledge required in order for us to do good quality research. There is more to it than that, as I've tried to explain. There is also a very important quality that Judith Hanks talks about in a chapter she produced for one of my books. And this is a book about research literacy, developing the research literacy of English language teachers. And you can download it for free from my website. I shared the QR code at the beginning of my presentation. It's a 2018 edited collection. And in it, Judith Hanks talks about how confidence is another important quality. In order for teachers to feel that they can do research, they also need to believe that this is something that belongs to them, that forms part of the professional identity, and that they can use this particular way of finding answers as a means of enriching their understanding of the classroom, as a means of engaging in professional learning as well, because research contributes to our professional learning as educators. Now, I've already mentioned that good empirical research starts with excellent questions. And research questions are the foundation of any study that we might want to conduct. So if we want to engage in empirical research, that is, we're collecting data, and in our case as language teachers, most often that data is coming from a school environment, from our colleagues or from our learners. Hence, we are collecting data from human participants. Then what we need is a good research question, or more than one, which enables us to identify the direction in which we're going. The research question basically gives us a sense of security and reassures us that our research project won't go in multiple directions. It defines the investigation. It provides us with the boundaries for our research. It tells us where we're going. We don't know the answers yet, but at least it helps us to follow a journey that we know can lead to answers and not to chaos and not to confusion. So research questions are fundamental, but at the same time, they're also very challenging to write. And working with language teachers in different contexts, I realize how difficult it is to write or to formulate a good research question. And another mistake that many of us make is to think that writing a research question is very easy. In reality, it is perhaps the most challenging task, because without a good research question, the entire research enterprise that you engage in collapses. So having that very good point of departure and dwelling upon it and thinking about it and taking time to actually come up with the right research question is valuable, because everything else, the rest of the research edifice that we built, then it is very, very solid, because the foundations are solid. So Zena O'Leary talks about how we could actually work towards good research questions. And this particular framework that I'm showing here, which is a diagram coming from her book, and you can find copies of this book easily, it shows us how, when we think of a topic, so we're interested in learning more about a particular form of assessment that is being implemented at our school. We're interested in, for example, our use of board work in the classwork. We're interested in the use of a specific technology that we're using with our learners, but we don't know whether it's working as well as we'd like it to. So those are the topics. So first, we have to be interested in a topic. We need to find the topic that we'd like to research. It starts from a topic. And that topic will eventually lead us to brainstorm different kinds of questions. So we generate as many questions as possible, and all of these questions are helping us to identify the best kind of angle, the best angle to have on the research topic. Once we have identified the angle, then we can start narrowing things down. And this is one of the challenges that many people, not only teachers, but many people who are doing research face. The challenge of narrowing things down. Most often, when we're new to the research process, we come up with very broad questions. Questions that are very difficult to answer because we don't have the resources, the time, the knowledge, or the expertise to find answers to them. Okay? So narrowing things down to something that is small scale, that is feasible within the limitations that we're working with, is crucial. If we don't narrow things down, then we're going to find it very difficult to actually do this particular research project. And that is the purpose of a research question. A research question is meant to be as narrow as possible, and it shows us what we're able to do and what we can't do. Okay, so narrowing things down and being very clear about the language, the words we're using in the research question, helps us to identify the direction in which we're going with this particular project. So if we follow these 3 steps, we come up with a research question. And what we need to remember is that a question can be researchable or not. That is, a question can lead to a research project, or it can actually fail. And it would fail because most often it is too broad, or else the wording we used in formulating the question doesn't work. And very soon I'm going to be showing you an example of a bad research question, and I'm going to invite you to tell me what's bad about it. So it's vital that when we come up with a research question, we are very clear that this is something that we can answer by means of our small-scale research project. It's doable, and it's doable for a number of reasons. For example, do we have enough time in which to actually find answers to this question? Or is the question written in such a way that it is going to require a massive amount of time to collect the data, to analyze the data, to perhaps write it all up, to make sense of it? Is the question written in such a way that we require resources that we don't currently have? They could be human resources, there could be issues of finance, or it could be merely a question of us not having the necessary expertise. So let us imagine a research question that can only be answered if we collect statistical data. And then we realize that we're not very good at analyzing statistical data. That means we've posed the wrong question. And that means that we need to revisit the research question and come up with wording that is ultimately within our range of expertise. It could also be that we've come up with a research question that is not doable because of ethical issues. Perhaps the research question can only be answered if we engage in practices that are frowned upon in the research community, because it might violate issues of consent. Okay, so we have to be aware of all of these problems when we come up with a research question. And we come up with a research question ultimately that is something that can lead to an answer. If we know from the start that the answer is going to be very difficult to get to, because of the reasons I've mentioned, then we need to go back to the drawing board. Now, how do we move from a topic to questions? And here I'm going to share some ideas of how we can generate questions. This is the brainstorming stage where we try to ultimately narrow the scope of our study to questions that lead to a particular angle on the topic. So we could start from our own personal experiences. And many teachers who engage in practitioner research, that's what they start with. What are the personal experiences of the issue that they're facing? It could be a problem that they've observed or something that they are curious about. What puzzles you, okay? And this, if you're interested in it, is something that we associate with exploratory practice. And there is a very good book on exploratory practice by Judith Hanks, which I invite you to read. You could also take an idea that you're very familiar with and look at it from a different angle, from a different perspective. Perhaps you've always thought of a specific issue in this way. But what if I try to take a step back, to distance myself from my way of thinking and look at things in a different manner, perhaps from the perspective of my learners or from the perspective of my colleagues? What answers will I come up with if I do that? I could also think of a theory that I'm familiar with, or a particular method or approach in ELT that I'm familiar with, but perhaps what I've read about it doesn't really match my own reality of the classroom. Okay, so I might have heard a lot about TBLT, but I want to find out whether this is something that works in my classroom or not. So let me try and do some actual research in order to find out whether this is something that could actually operate successfully with my learners. I could also, by engaging with the research literacy, I could also have identified a gap. That is, there's a lot of research published on this particular topic, but no one seems to have looked at this specific angle, especially this specific angle within the kind of context in which I operate and the kind of learners that I am teaching. In that case, then here we have identified a potential direction for our study. You could also use techniques like metaphors, images, songs to think creatively about your topic. You can find some literature on this. These are ways of thinking more creatively about the issues that you're interested in as a practitioner. Mind maps. Mind maps help us to identify connections amongst different areas that we might be interested in. You could also think of unique cases or exceptions. So, for example, your research might not be something that is following the narrative that everyone seems to be following, but you are looking at things from a different perspective by trying to understand the exceptions rather than the rule. So that is another way of thinking of questions. And finally, research, as I mentioned when I quoted Christine Kuhn, research helps us to think and understand what we currently don't know. So it is a means by which we throw some light on the darkness being the stuff that we are currently ignorant about, the stuff that we currently don't know. So research is that spotlight that shines in the darkness and helps us to make sense of the language classroom. So that is another way of going about it. What is it that I don't currently know about what's happening in my classroom? How could I find answers that help me understand this issue better? And let me start brainstorming questions. Now, these are some guidelines on how we can formulate effective research questions. So research questions ultimately need to be interesting to us, potentially interesting to our colleagues and to our learners, and they need to also be questions that are worth investigating. For example, if there is already a massive amount of literature on the topic that we are interested in investigating, is it really worth doing this kind of research project? Or are you going to merely confirm what's already in the literature? Okay, so if other people have conducted the research and perhaps the research was conducted in contexts that are similar to you, to your own, then why bother doing it? Okay, you're merely going to do a lot of work, but the answers might already be out there. Okay, and here I'm not going to talk about whether you have access to that knowledge, because that is a different discussion, and I am aware of issues of equity, that is, a lack of access to knowledge, but that's not the purpose of this particular talk. The other thing is sometimes our project, our research project, might have more than one research question. What's important here is to remember that the two questions need to be linked to one another in a meaningful manner. They can't be two questions that are going to lead us in different directions altogether. They have to be connected to one another. And for small-scale research projects, we have to remember that the number of research questions needs to be very, very small. I would say not more than two. Okay, not more than two questions if we are going to do a small-scale research project in our school, perhaps in our classroom with our learners. And the wording of the questions, as I've already mentioned, is something that we need to spend quite a bit of time on to make sure that our assumptions about language teaching and learning don't find their way in the questions that we come up with. We have to think about the words we use and how the words we use might ultimately set a particular direction for our question, perhaps reinforcing assumptions, which is very dangerous in research because we don't want to confirm what we believe. We want to ultimately find out what we don't know. So the wording of the questions makes a huge difference. The wording must also be unambiguous, okay? It can't lead to potentially problematic answers because a word or a phrase can be interpreted in multiple ways. Binary questions are best avoided when formulating research questions, meaning the question shouldn't merely lead to a yes or no answer. We have to pose questions that are open and that can be answered in many different ways because the answer is out there for us to discover. A yes or a no question is very limiting. It limits our project and doesn't tell us anything that is rich in nature. The other important rule of thumb that I'd like to share with you is that ideally, when we formulate research questions, we start with research questions that use what and how first, okay, before we pose the why question. It shouldn't be a question about why something is happening before we've understood properly how something is happening or what is actually happening. So the what and the how most often come before a why question when it comes to research questions. For the time being, I'm only talking about research questions. Let's look at an example. So I've already talked a bit about important guidelines that we have to bear in mind when it comes to research questions. What I'd like you to do now is look at this basic research question: do girls learn languages more easily than boys? And what I'd like you to do is go to the chat box and try to identify as many problems with this research question as possible and write them in the chat box. And then we'll have a discussion of some of the issues with this research question. I'm going to be looking at the chat box to see what you come up with. Ahmed, since we started a bit late, how much more time do I have?
Well, I mean, we are flexible in terms of time, Daniel. It's absolutely up to you. I mean, we don't want to pressurize you, but we are flexible in time. So whatever you feel suitable.
Okay, thank you. So yes, so some people are saying that it's a binary question. Yes, that limits the potential answers that the question can come up with. Anything else? What other issues are there? Okay, Ruba, it didn't talk about what is it. Okay, so one of the things that we don't know is which languages we're talking about. Are we talking about all languages? Okay, that's way too broad. What the question doesn't tell us also, yes, it doesn't provide details about the problem itself, okay? It doesn't tell us much about which girls and boys we're talking about, their ages, in which context, the language level, okay? Why are we comparing boys against girls? What does more easily mean, okay? So this question is highly problematic for several reasons, as you're rightly pointing out. Let us go over some of them. So first and foremost, as a research question, it doesn't work because it needs to be much narrower than it currently is. we don't know much about the participants that we're interested in examining. So which kind of girls, okay, in which culture, what age, which social class do they belong to, what level of language proficiency do they have, what kind of schooling context are we talking about, okay, because we know that learners are different from one school to another, let alone from one country to another. The same applies to boys. So the same issue with the word boys in the question. We don't know what level of comparison we're engaging in here. Are we comparing like with like, or are we comparing very different categories of boys and girls? And the term more easily, as I've mentioned, what does that mean? Okay, how can we actually come up with answers that help us to determine whether girls learn languages more easily than boys or not? Okay, so what does that mean? Language is made up of different skills and different systems. If we have a research question that looks not only at different languages, but at all of the skills and systems in a single language, that makes the question very, very broad, and hence very difficult for anyone to actually come up with answers. And as you mentioned, it is a binary question. So that is also a reason for which the question is not researchable. And there might be other reasons. So once we have devoted a substantial amount of time to the research question, and we are confident that the research question can be answered, and that we have the means and the time to actually answer the research question, how are we going to answer it? So the methodological design stage of our project follows the formulation of the research question. We should never make the mistake of thinking of the design prior to having questions that we can work with. If we don't have the questions yet, it's useless thinking about the design and the methods that form part of the design, because that is likely to backfire. So we can think of the methodological design as the plan that takes us from the point of departure, which is the research question, to the destination. And we don't yet know what that destination is. We know in which direction we should be heading, but we don't know where we're going to arrive. So the methodological design is the means to get there. And a lot of time needs to be spent on the methodological design because it is our means of coming up with the answers that we desire. So there are multiple ways in which we can answer the research questions, but we have to remember that we cannot just pick any method. We cannot pick any method that we prefer or that we feel we like just because of our preferences. There are certain things that we have to remember. The methodological design that we adopt is the one that is best suited to the research questions. It is always the research question that determines what design we come up with, not our own inclinations or preferences. And just because we might have a preference for interviews, it doesn't mean that interviews are the best approach to finding answers to the research question that we've come up with. Okay, so that is a mistake, to merely go with preferences and inclinations rather than to think of the best way of answering the specific research questions that we've come up with. Obviously, we also have to be informed by the context in which we're doing this study. And that context might also impose certain constraints upon us. So it might be impossible to distribute a questionnaire because we don't have enough participants, or because people are likely not to bother responding to a questionnaire. So there are also contextual considerations to bear in mind. And the other important consideration is what works well for you as the researcher. So on a practical level, do you have access to the participants? Do you have access to the knowledge and skills you require to actually use these particular methods? Or is there a lack of expertise in using certain methods, and perhaps you need to go back to the research questions and come up with something that can be answered by means of a different methodology? There are also epistemological issues, okay? How do we generate knowledge? And is this methodology that we're going to adopt going to produce the kind of knowledge that is appropriate for us as the people conducting this research? So these are important considerations, but definitely the one that perhaps I would like you to remember most of all is that the methodology that we adopt should always be the one that is most appropriate to the research question, and not going with the methodology first before we have formulated the research questions. Now, the design that we come up with will lead to data. And here I'm going to simplify things quite a lot. In reality, it's a much more complex understanding of data. So data, in a simplistic manner, can be described as being quantitative versus qualitative. And we know that quantitative leads to numerical data, whereas qualitative data is something that is most often understood in terms of textual data, whether it's an interview transcript, whether it's a diagram that someone has produced, photos that we've taken, okay? So qualitative data is different as well. This doesn't mean, as I said, this doesn't mean that, for example, in qualitative research, we don't include numbers, okay? Because even when talking about interviews, we do mention numbers, and we do distinguish in terms of perspectives, how many people believe one thing versus how many people believe another thing. So I need to emphasize that this is very simplistic. For the purposes of this talk, it's sufficient, but data can be understood in terms of these two broad categories. And these two broad categories of data, they are different ways of thinking about the world and about where the information is going to come from. They are also two ways of analyzing data. They lead to different ways of analyzing data, working with it, interpreting it. What's helpful is to think of data in terms of a continuum rather than a dichotomy. It's more helpful to think of it as a continuum, and the collection of the data can also be done in multiple ways. So this is where in the research community, we talk of mixed methods. So we talk of combining different methodologies because they lead to different kinds of data, and that enriches the research process. And it enriches our understanding of the phenomenon that we're interested in. Now, if we had to compare the qualitative versus the quantitative, and this is once again a very simplistic distinction between the two, we would look at qualitative data as involving the collection of textual or visual data, whereas quantitative data is something that is more numeric or statistical. Qualitative data helps us to understand and explore a phenomenon in depth, okay? So we try to look at issues that are general issues, but understanding them through the perspectives of the participants. And we are looking at themes, okay? So we're interested in the themes that are generated from our analysis of the data. And we are primarily interested in the way people engage in meaning making. how do people interpret this phenomenon that we're interested in investigating? We're also interested in subjectivity, okay? We realize that the way people describe reality or describe the phenomenon that we're investigating is highly subjective, and there is an interpretive process involved. And since we're working with small numbers of participants, since this is more often a small-scale research project, uniqueness, elements of uniqueness are as important as the major trends that we come across in our data. Quantitative data, on the other hand, most often is there to describe trends and relationships, okay? In terms of bigger numbers, the focus is more often narrower, okay? And sometimes quantitative data and quantitative approaches are more appropriate for large-scale studies. So when we have bigger numbers to work with, then perhaps using a survey makes more sense than merely relying on a few semi-structured interviews. When people think of quantitative data, they associate it with objectivity, generalizability, and even though these are concepts that are useful when thinking of, for example, survey data, large-scale studies, they might not always be very useful for us in the context of practitioner research, because we're dealing with small numbers, we're dealing with issues that take place in a very small kind of context, and it is better to try and dig deeper into the issue and to understand the phenomenon in terms of all its richness, rather than merely staying at surface level and trying to generalize to other contexts. That might not be something that is useful for us as people who are doing practitioner research. So it's not necessarily a case of either or, okay? Most often we have to combine the two, and it might also be necessary to combine the two if the research question that we've come up with demands that. So the research question is ultimately what determines what kind of research we end up doing and what kind of data we end up collecting. And as I mentioned, the continuum between the qualitative and the quantitative is something to bear in mind. So a mixed methods design is useful sometimes, but even though it's a very valuable thing to do and to engage in, because it makes our research more rigorous, at the same time, we also have to understand that practitioners might not have the expertise or the time or the resources to actually use multiple methods when doing small-scale research. So sometimes they might prefer using just one method because that is the most efficient way of finding the answer to the questions. And that is also fine. So it is what's good for your research question, for your study, and what's good for you as the researcher. That is something that we should always try to remember. Now, here I have a little activity for you. If you were to go through these different scenarios, okay, these different sentences, and merely think of whether they are qualitative or quantitative, okay, that would be helpful. You can write in the chat box if you'd like, but it's more of a reflection exercise. What I'd like you to do is go through each one of these different scenarios or different examples and think of whether you would label it as qualitative or quantitative research. But also keep an open mind, because what we might immediately assume to be quantitative, for example, might also involve qualitative methods, okay? So it might not always be as clear-cut as we think it is. And I'm going to talk about just two examples. So for example, if we look at the third one, teacher Sophia, here we're looking at one individual. So we're looking at, most probably, a case study of a teacher. There might also be multiple case studies in this particular research, but we're looking at one teacher. Now, some people might immediately assume, since we're looking at just one individual, then this is probably some kind of qualitative research that we're doing. But look at the fact that here we're also referring to what teacher Sophia does with her group, okay? And we are describing that numerically. We're describing it by means of percentage. So most probably what happened here is that teacher Sophia was observed teaching, okay? And she was observed using her group's shared L1 in 45% of her responses to students. So when talking to her students, when perhaps answering the questions, she used the L1. And someone measured that, but they didn't do so in a qualitative manner. They measured it quantitatively. Okay, so most probably they used a checklist for this purpose, and that checklist led to numeric data. So it was a quantitative approach being used within this case study of the teacher. In the last one, 9 out of 10 students in the group work with the SMART goal approach. So here, one possibility is that 10 students were interviewed. They were asked questions about how they use a specific approach. 9 of them said that they work with the SMART goal approach. 1 of them didn't. So the data might have been collected in a qualitative manner, okay, by means of interviews. Not necessarily, but this is one way of doing it. And then, in order to describe that qualitative data, numbers still featured. Because when we're talking of small numbers, a small number of interviewees, for example, we still need to say half of them, 9 of them said this, whereas 1 individual said this, okay? We need to make a distinction there because certain words like quantifiers are not helpful. If we merely say some students in the group work with the SMART goal approach, we're not telling our reader, our audience, what that word some means, okay? So even referring to numbers when working with qualitative data is sometimes useful. The purpose of this task is to make you think of how our assumptions about what's qualitative or quantitative research can sometimes be challenged by the very nature in which we work with the data and make sense of it. So we've talked about the value of coming up with researchable research questions. We've talked about the significance of choosing the most appropriate methodological design. And now we come to how. How do we actually do this? And there are different tools that we can use. Earlier, at the beginning of this talk, I talked about the significance of research literacy and how, in terms of research literacy, one important aspect of it is the technical knowledge, the knowledge necessary to come up with a survey, draft an interview guide, conduct a semi-structured interview, or moderate a focus group. These are all technical skills. So the how aspect refers to the different tools that are available to us, and there are many others, okay, besides these. What's important is that the tool that we use is always the most appropriate for the research question that we've posed. And it is also a tool that we feel confident working with, that we have the knowledge to use, and that we are also confident about using in terms of the data that it generates. That is, we're able to analyze the kind of data that it generates. Now, briefly, I'm going to talk about one approach to doing practitioner research. So practitioner research is an umbrella term for any kind of research that teachers may wish to conduct in the classroom with the learners, and they are doing so because they want to understand what's happening in the classroom. They want to understand their own practices, their own beliefs, the beliefs and practices of the learners. And there are different ways of going about practitioner research. Action research seems to be one of the most popular approaches, and we keep hearing about it. Now, what's very important here is that when we think of action research, we're very clear about what it means. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because I do come across many teachers who have an understanding of what action research means, but most often it is more of a misunderstanding of what action research actually consists of. So let's be clear that action research is one approach to doing practitioner research, and it is not the only way of doing practitioner research. It is a very popular approach in education, in nursing, and in other professions, but it is a very systematic approach. And its systematicity might not always work for everyone. So we have to be very clear about what is entailed when we use the term action research. And people who have written about action research, they talk about how it is a means by which you make sense of your context, of your practices, and of the practices of the people within that context, but you do so systematically. Moreover, action research entails an element of reflection. And in fact, one of the stages of the action research process, and there are different ways of envisaging this process, but I'll be sharing with you one of the most popular ones, is reflection. So reflection is a vital part of action research, but it is not the only stage, okay? As we know, reflective inquiry is another way of engaging in a systematic process of learning about your practices, okay? And if you're interested in that, I encourage you to read the work of Thomas Farrell. But when it comes to action research, there are specific stages to follow, and another important feature of action research is that it is cyclical. That is, there are multiple cycles. It is not something that we do just once, but we keep going through the cycles until we've understood the problem that we started from, because action research is most often a response to a problem, okay? And the changes we make in our classroom with our learners help us to resolve that problem. So there is an element of action, but the action is always directed at resolving an issue that we have observed in our classroom. Now, there are certain features of action research that we need to be aware of. And here I am citing Anne Burns, who is one of the world authorities when it comes to action research, and I encourage you to look at her work. She has many papers available for free online, and she's written quite a lot about action research. So one important feature, as I've already mentioned, is reflection. But that reflection is directed at bringing about a change in the context that we are investigating, which is most often our context, okay? So the practices that we see happening, the practices that we are engaged in, we want to change those. And we're doing so via reflection, but also via the collection of data and our reflection on that data. Action research for Anne Burns and for others is small scale. So it's a small scale project, and it is very contextualized. So the contextual features of the study matter. and who we are as the practitioner who is doing the research and who our learners are matters quite a lot. Besides that, action research can also be collaborative in nature. So we can involve our colleagues. So there is something called collaborative action research. We can involve our learners, okay? Don't think of your learners as sources of data. Think of them as co-researchers as well. And if you're interested in this way of thinking about children, of thinking about learners, then I encourage you to read the work of Anna Maria Pinter. But it's important to remember that action research is systematic. So you need to follow a particular process and you need to engage in the stages in a very particular manner. And that level of systematicity is one of its defining features. And that's why I said that action research is one approach to research. It is not the only approach, though. So we have to remember that as well. It is also empowering. So it positions us as people who are able to find answers to our questions and to do so in a rigorous manner and to learn from the research process for the benefit of ourselves as the professionals, but also for the benefit of our community. That is the learners, colleagues, school that form part of that community. So, action research is about problematizing an issue. So we're problematizing an issue. We are thinking of something that's happening in our classroom, something that perhaps we're not very happy with, and we want to find a way of bringing about change. And as you can see here in this model of action research that's coming from a book by Camis and McTaggart, the plan is at the very start of the cycle. So we plan what we want to do, we formulate our research question, we determine how we're going to collect the data, we determine what intervention we're going to make in our practices, in our teaching, in our students' learning. And then once we have that very clear plan, then we act, we take action. So we, for example, experiment with a particular methodology. We use specific materials. We make a change in the techniques that we usually use when providing feedback. Okay, that is the action. What needs to happen is that we're also collecting data about that action. And this is the observation phase. So we might be asking our students for feedback. We might be recording ourselves teaching. We might invite a colleague to come and observe us, okay? That observation phase is the data that we will then reflect upon. And we reflect on whether the intervention that we've engaged in has led to positive change, has enabled us to resolve the problem or not. And most likely, we will realize that some changes, some other changes are required. We might need to tweak the plan. And that is where we go to the next cycle. So there is a revision process after the first cycle, and then we repeat the cycle all over again, but with certain changes in place. And the reflection stage at the end of the second cycle will determine whether we need to go to a third cycle or not. Okay, so when thinking of action research, it's very important to remember that it has very specific features. One of them is systematicity, and the other one is that it is a cyclical kind of process. So we shouldn't use the term without realizing whether what we're describing with the term actually merits the term or not. Okay? Because not all practitioner research is action research. So these elements, okay, these 4 stages of the action research process are there to guide us in doing action research. In the planning stage, we've identified what the problem is, we've determined how to engage in action. Then we actually produce an intervention, and this happens over a specific period of time. It might happen over a number of lessons, over a number of weeks. We collect data about the effectiveness of that particular intervention, and we reflect on the effects of the action. And that reflection will then determine what changes we make in the next cycle of the process. Now, I'm aware that I've been speaking for quite a bit, so I'm now going to talk about dissemination, looking primarily at academic journals. I'm going to share some best practices, some things to reflect upon and to consider, and to realize that when we write for an academic journal, there are certain expectations in place. Academic journals are not only avenues that academics can exploit, okay? Practitioners can also write for academic journals. They are not the only way in which we disseminate our research as practitioners. So there are also magazines, there are also teacher conferences, there are also newsletters published by teacher associations. So there are different venues for our research. But since I've been told that you're going to be producing a paper for an academic journal, then I'm going to provide some guidelines on this. So first and foremost, as I mentioned, there are different places where to publish. When it comes to academic journals, we have to choose wisely. We have to choose the right kind of journal, and that journal needs to be receptive to practitioner research. So not all academic journals in our field, in ELT, in TESOL, and language education, they're not all open to receiving reports from teachers who are writing about the practitioner inquiry, okay? So we have to choose the right kind of journal. And what's important is that if we are interested in disseminating our research, and there is no obligation to do so, okay? So don't associate practitioner research with dissemination. We conduct practitioner research primarily for our benefit and for that of our learners, but we have no obligation to share it. But if we want to share the knowledge that ensues from practitioner inquiry, we have to know where we might eventually publish it. Okay, so that is a very important consideration because different journals have different expectations and different requirements. Some journals, for example, expect you to produce 8,000-word papers. Other journals, for example, like ELT journal, they have a much shorter word count. It's a much more limited word count, and you need to also be aware that a journal like ELTJ always expects its authors to focus on the practical dimension. Okay, so they're bearing in mind the practitioners who are also reading this journal. So knowing where we want to publish is very important because it will determine how we write up our research. That means we need to think very carefully about the selection of the journal. Is this going to be a journal that has a regional audience, perhaps a national audience? There are also national journals, or an international audience, okay? And that consideration is important because we're always writing with an audience in mind. Is the audience of this journal primarily made up of academics, or is it primarily made up of practitioners, or is it a mix of both? Okay, that also affects how we produce our paper. What sort of paper am I going to write? Is this paper something that is only related to my discipline? Or can I also consider journals that are beyond my immediate discipline? So for example, if we're working in ELT, is the research that I've conducted only relevant for journals within ELT, or can I also look at general education more broadly? Issues of where the journal is indexed. So this matters for people who are interested in, for example, promotion, and who are interested in the prestige of a particular journal. But it might not always be an important consideration for practitioners wanting to disseminate their research with the broader ELT community. Issues of impact factor, another consideration for academics most often, but not something that might matter for practitioners who want to publish their research. Is the journal peer-reviewed? So this is something to bear in mind, because if the journal doesn't have a peer review process, then it might be much easier for us to get the paper published. The peer review process makes it far more difficult for our paper to be published, but the advantage of the peer review process is that we receive feedback from reviewers, and most often there is anonymity protecting our identity and the identity of the reviewers. But the review process is there not only to help the journal determine whether the paper is good enough or not, but also to help us as authors to improve our manuscript. So the peer review process has certain advantages to it. Obviously, peer review makes the journal more prestigious in the eyes of the people who read research. And am I being realistic? So if this is the first paper we've ever written, if this is the first piece of research we've ever conducted, it might be unrealistic to aim for a journal that has a very high rejection rate, or that only attracts a very kind of research. So we have to be realistic about where is it most likely for my paper to find a home, okay? And we shouldn't be excessively ambitious when thinking of the journal that we choose. We need to choose a journal that is appropriate for the kind of research that we've conducted, and that is a good means by which we disseminate what we've learned from the process. Here we have a link to, for example, a highly prestigious journal in our field, in applied linguistics as a whole. But obviously, this is a journal that is very prestigious, has a very high rejection rate, has a very high impact factor, and hence it is very difficult to get into. So perhaps we need to start small before eventually, once we make research something that is part of our professional identity and we start producing papers on a regular manner, we start aiming a bit higher. One important consideration, irrespective of how prestigious the journal is, whether it's peer-reviewed or not, is to familiarize ourselves with the journal guidelines, the author guidelines that every journal has in place. Making sure that the paper is written with the journal in mind, and not merely coming up with a paper, submitting it without having read the guidelines, because that will most likely lead to a rejection. The editor will immediately tell us this is not aligned with the guidelines and hence we cannot accept it. So writing it with those guidelines in mind makes a lot of sense. It saves us time, and it also saves the editors a lot of time. So issues of length, the referencing style that is used, okay? So for example, APA 7th edition is a very popular style, and many of us know how to use it, but it doesn't mean that all journals use it. Some journals prefer Harvard or some other kind of referencing style. So our paper has also it has to be adapted to the referencing style that is preferred by the journal. The abstract. So most journal articles require an abstract, and we need to spend some time thinking about that. because that is the thing that most readers will read first of all. Keywords, the structure of the article. So how am I going to structure the article? And we need to bear this in mind. Now, most research papers are structured in a very particular manner. So we have an introduction, we have a literature review, we have a methodology section, we have the presentation of the findings, and we have a discussion of the findings followed by a conclusion. And then come the references. But sometimes we might be invited by the journal to not necessarily follow that particular structure. It might be easier to produce the narrative of our research in a style, in a structure that is somewhat different from the one that is typically used in the social sciences. So that is something else to bear in mind. Tables and figures, how many can we include? Does the journal allow us to include figures in color? Kind of spelling, is it British English and American English? Are there guidelines about that? Okay, so this is also something that is mentioned sometimes in author guidelines. The layout of the manuscript that we submit, as well as what do we include on the title page and whether we can include our details or not. If an article is going through peer review, a double-blind peer review process, that is two reviewers looking at our article, then our details are not included in the article. We have to anonymize the manuscript so that the reviewers can read it without being influenced by who we are. And we don't know who they are. So that is also something that is meant to make the peer review process fairer. Here you have the guidelines that are produced for ELT Journal, another popular journal in our field. And now I'd like to conclude by talking about the writing stage, okay? What's important is that when we report on our research, we focus on telling the story of that research. So we have to ensure that the kind of structure that we adopt in our article is the structure that makes most sense for that narrative. So there is a logical progress that we follow rather than a chronological process. We also need to bear in mind that we need to tell that story, tell the story of the research process and what was learned from it, but then we are going to devote time to editing our article and not trying to do two things at the same time. But the editing of the article prior to submission makes a lot of sense because it enhances the chances of the article being accepted for publication. What's important is the reader. What is the reader going to take from reading our article? And hence, the argument that we'd like to make via our research paper needs to be very, very clear. It shouldn't be buried somewhere in the article, and the reader has to read between the lines or figure out what the argument actually consists of. So the argument needs to be as clear as possible, and we need to make the life of our reader as easy as possible. It might be helpful to get feedback from colleagues about our paper, feedback that helps us to look at our paper, at our article, from a different perspective. Sometimes when we produce something, when we produce a piece of writing, we are too invested in it for us to see its potential flaws, to understand that what might be very clear for us might be gobbledygook for our reader. So we benefit from asking colleagues that we trust, and we trust them to tell us the truth, to actually read our article, provide us with feedback, and then once we've made changes, we submit the article for publication. And for those of you who are just embarking on this journey and who are interested in sharing their knowledge and in writing for journals, it's not only producing a research paper that leads you to getting published. You could also write a review of a book. Many journals invite people to approach them to produce book reviews, or a response to a particular article that was published in the journal. So there are different ways of getting your views published. And that is also a good way of starting this process of writing for journals, whether they are academic journals or professional journals, okay? So we can write about our views, our research for different kinds of journals. And don't forget the audience once again, and that audience might be broader than your immediate context. Because, for example, if a journal is published online, even if it is a national journal or regional journal, it might still get international readers. So make things as clear for them as possible, and don't assume things that just because you take them for granted, they are going to understand them straight away. Now, here I've come to the end of this talk on doing small-scale research, starting from the very planning to the dissemination stages. And I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. You can either write in the chat box or perhaps even unmute yourself. Ahmed will guide me about what's the best way of doing things.
Thanks a lot, Daniel. This is really informative and useful. I think this is really seamless way of introducing a very complicated, I think, concept into something really simplified and easy to understand. I really myself benefited a lot from this, especially when it comes to practitioner research and how actually research comes under that. So I myself have questions, but later I'll ask those. But for the participants, please feel free. If you want to send your question in the chat box, or if you prefer to unmute and speak to Daniel, you are more than welcome to do so, please. So if you have any questions, go ahead. Yes, Mujahid, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Ahmed. Thank you. Hello.
Hi, Mujahid, go ahead. We can hear you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Ahmed. Thank you, Dr. Daniel, for the valuable information you've just presented. The lecture was really insightful. I took useful notes and I learned a lot. And that said, I have a question we can't really avoid, as we all know, AI or artificial intelligence developing and becoming more a part of our lives, our daily life, and we expect to grow even more in the near future. Because of that, plagiarism is starting to take on a new shape and meaning. So, are there any clear limits we should be aware of, or a kind of code of ethics we need to follow? As you know, research field should be impartial and trustworthy. So thank you very much.
Thank you for the question and for your feedback on the talk. If I understood you correctly, you're asking about the role of artificial intelligence in the research process, perhaps even in the writing of articles, and the ethical issues that are associated with it. Well, yes, this is a very valid point. It is also something that is at the forefront of how the academic community is thinking about the role of AI. And there are different aspects to the issue. So let us start unpacking it. First and foremost, we need to be very positive about the technology when thinking of what role it can play in the research process. So nowadays, we know that using generative AI to analyze data, to think about research projects, to even come up with appropriate research questions to brainstorm potential angles on a topic that we're interested in, we can use it for this purpose. It can also be used as a reflective partner. This is something that I'm currently writing about, using generative AI as a partner in the reflective process that we engage in as language teachers. So rather than engaging in dialogic reflection with a colleague, we can engage in that kind of reflection with an artificial intelligence, okay, with a tool. And it helps us to make sense of our puzzles, our conundrums, our questions, and to adopt a better approach to the investigation of the issues that we're interested in. It can also help us with the design of research instruments, with the analysis of research data, and even helps us with polishing our research publications if need be. But obviously there are certain things to bear in mind when it comes to ethics, the ethical dimension. And one of the things that many journals are currently asking their contributors to be upfront about is the contribution of these tools to the production of the articles that are being submitted for review. And we have to ultimately be ethical in the way we produce the article to make sure that our originality is still something that we associate with the article that we've produced. If we are unethical in our use of the technology, it means that we've relied too heavily on the technology, and what we submit for publication is not really ours to claim ownership of. So even though our name might be on that article, it is not actually something that we've produced, but it has been produced by a tool, and there's nothing in terms of ideas and in terms of wording that actually belongs to us. So that is an unethical use of the technology. With respect to research ethics, we can even go before that process and think of how, when we use the technology for things like the analysis of interview data, have the participants provided us with consent not only to interview them, okay, which is expected, we need our students' consent if we plan to interview them, but have they also consented to us taking those recordings, uploading them to ChatGPT, for example, and then analyzing the recordings for the purpose of data analysis? Because once uploaded to the tool, we've basically handed over the voices of our participants and placed them on a server somewhere else in the world. So consent is also about being as transparent as possible about the fact that we are managing the data in this manner. Okay, so if we're transcribing an interview, have we told our participants that we intend to use generative AI for that purpose? For example, otter.ai. If we're analyzing statistical data or interview data, have we told people that we intend to use generative AI for that purpose? Okay. Besides that, ethics also implies that we are aware that when we use these tools for these purposes, that is data analysis, these tools operate in what is being called a black box. So they don't explain to you how the process happened. And you might do a particular task with your data today with a specific tool. You do the same task in a few hours or in a few days later, and the output is very different. So we have to be aware of the fact that the output is not always going to be the same. So as researchers, if we're using, for example, thematic analysis, and we're using the Braun and Clark 6-step stage, six-step process, we are likely to always come up with the same themes and patterns when we look at the data, okay? Or largely the same. But when we use these tools and we trust them blindly, we have to be aware of the fact that the output might vary from one iteration to another. So this means that besides using these tools ethically and ensuring that we are still proud to put our name on the product, that is the paper, the presentation, the talk, we are also using these tools critically and not trusting them blindly and always questioning whatever it is that the tool is generating for us. Having said that, as I started saying when replying to your question, it is very important that we embrace the use of these tools in the research process as practitioners. So when we're engaging in practitioner research, it's important to embrace the use of these tools, but to do so ethically and critically. That is a very important thing to bear in mind. And the ethics of it, when we write for a journal, is nowadays being expected by the journal itself. So we have to be honest about how these tools were used, and we have to be clear about the fact that there are certain uses which mean that what we have produced might no longer be our own work. So that is also something to bear in mind. I don't know whether that fully answers your question.
I think this is a good answer to Mujahid's question, and it shows that AI is part of our daily life. It's, we can't deny it. It's inevitable. It's there. It's out there, and this applies not only to research but also to university work, to assignments, to essays submitted by students. I think you summarized it really well, Daniel, by saying you have to. It's all about your own ethics standards and how you view things when you decide to put your name on something as your final product. There is one question here in the chat by Dr. Yahya, and I think you've touched upon these areas when you talked about research questions and how to formulate research questions and move from research questions to the methodology that you will adopt in your research. But if you can touch upon the features of strong research questions again for students, Daniel, that would be great.
So strong or good research questions are questions that help to set the direction for our research, and they give us a very specific direction. They also help to establish the boundaries or the parameters in which the investigation is going to be conducted, and hence we are narrowing things down and ensuring that we don't go in too many different directions. So we have a very clear focus. The question is also a good research question if it is something that is doable. That is, it leads to a project that we can do because we have the resources for it, we have the time for it, we have the expertise for it, and it is compliant with the ethical standards that operate within our context. So that makes it a good research question. If we realize that these elements are not present, then we have to go back to the beginning of the process and pay more attention to how we are formulating the question. Because the biggest flaw in any study that we can conduct as practitioners is ultimately not having a very good point of departure. And you can immediately tell whether the research edifice that we've built, the weakest point most often is found in the research question. If the research question is not sufficiently robust, then everything can crumble.
That's excellent. I think robustness is key here, and I like it when you highlighted, Daniel, that perhaps I don't know, perhaps it's a common mistake that students who are many educators decide the methodology and then say, oh, I'll go quantitative, and then I'll go back to see what I'll investigate in the field. Perhaps that's a good way to move from research questions and then decide accordingly, based on the wording or the nature of the research questions that you have, the methods or the approach that you will go. And having those like research question, approach, and then answers, I think it's seamless and straightforward. And I would also recommend that book edited by Daniel, and Daniel referred to this in the beginning of the talk, Becoming Research Literate. I think for our students, this is something really useful to visit and read, because it is written in a way that really tied to classroom research and how you can build that confidence. And perhaps this is not really talked much about, Daniel, the like confidence when conducting research or confidence in research skills. And this might empower students psychologically in terms of, you don't have to be an expert in research to start writing research. You don't have to be a scholar. Yeah. So you can just start by writing for a journal, by writing for a blog, by writing your own blog, writing your diaries, and then step by step you write research based on your observation and experiments. If we have any more questions, please feel free to ask. Let's have a few questions and then we'll wrap.
Thanks for mentioning the book again. I'll be happy to send you a copy, Ahmed, or at least the link to it, so that you can share it with the people who've registered for this particular webinar. Another book that I would like to share with you, it's another open access publication that I produced for the British Council. It's a how-to guide. That is how to encourage teachers to engage in research, that is their own practitioner inquiry. And it basically explains the entire process from beginning to end, from the planning stage to the publication stage. It's a brief guide. It's freely available, but I'll share that with you as well, so that the people who have followed this webinar can go through it. It also includes some data that was collected from the MENA region, that is Middle East and North Africa, as a basis for then providing people with guidelines on how to do their own practitioner inquiry.
Excellent. That's going to be practical and useful for students, I think. Thank you. Any questions? Roba, I think you had a question. You raised your hand.
Yes, I do.
Yes, Roba, go
ahead. Thank you so much for this rich, informative meeting. And basically, I've got two questions. The first one is there like frequent mistakes that like popular ones that teacher commit when it comes to doing their own research?
Yes, so popular mistakes, first and foremost, the first one being that they might not see research as something that they are eligible to do. So because of the job description, because of the expectations associated with the job by the superiors, because they believe that they don't have the time for it. So they don't see research as part of the professional identity. So that's the biggest mistake practitioners can actually make, thinking that research belongs to others, belongs to university professors, belongs to professional organizations, belongs to consultants, and it doesn't belong to teachers. That's the biggest mistake that teachers can make when thinking of research. The other mistake is to associate research. So even if they decide to do research, to associate research with very narrow conceptualizations of the process. So think of research as only involving, for example, quantitative data. So whenever I do these kind of workshops with teachers, even in my own continent and in Europe, some teachers tell me research is about statistics, or research is about being completely neutral and impartial. Research is about collecting lots of data. So these are very narrow conceptions of research which hinder teachers from going about it in ways that are truly beneficial for them, their colleagues, and their learners. And that is another big mistake that they can make, to think that the only good research is the research that certain academics do, okay? Academics who have massive amounts of resources, research assistants, who have the job description for it, have the expectations associated with it to do that kind of research. But let us not make that mistake. The other mistakes are then on a technical level. So, for example, not coming up with research questions in the way that I've indicated, opting for specific methods because those are the only methods that they're familiar with, or they are the only ones that they've heard about, or associating practitioner research only with action research, thinking that action research and practitioner research are synonyms, when in fact, action research is only one example of practitioner research. These are the kinds of mistakes, if we want to call them that practitioners typically make when they start thinking about themselves doing research.
Thanks, Ruba. What was your second question?
Yeah, my second question is that can we be more flexible when it comes to methods, meaning that I would be eclectic, like I wouldn't be loyal to one method that I would, follow, like the whole method from the very beginning to the end. So I would start with that method, and when I reach what matters for me, I would stop in that method and go on to another method, like 30% method number 1, 20% method number 2, like 50% method number 3. Is that okay? Or just like we have got to stick to one method, or as a whole, like.
So when I was talking about methodological design, I'm trying to see whether I've understood your question correctly. When we think of methodological design, we always choose the design that is most appropriate for our research question. And we choose that design because we determine that it's the best way of answering the question. So the question is telling us, I can be answered in this manner. So it's not a question of just mixing methods because we feel like it, or else we get fed up of one method and going to another, and that kind of eclecticism. And that might not be helpful because we won't come up with the answers that our question can lead to if we use the right kind of design. So what I would suggest is, yes, be eclectic in your approach if you have the time, the expertise, and the resources for it, but only insofar as that eclecticism is going to lead you to answer your research question. And only because you have thought about the best kind of design for your research questions, and because you want to, for example, triangulate the methods that you're using to make your research process even more robust. So it's not about preferences. So, for example, we start collecting data in one way and then we say, I don't feel like doing this anymore, let me go to something else. That's not ideal because that is obviously going to erode the quality of our research endeavor, and it's not going to help us to answer those questions as effectively as possible. So when we come up with good research questions, we also need to choose wisely when it comes to the research design. And that research design, if it's going to involve mixed methods, then we always use the methods that are most appropriate to our research questions.
Fair enough.
Excuse me,
Yeah.
Professor.
Yasmin? Yes, Yasmin, go ahead.
Yes. Okay. First of all, thanks for Professor Daniel and for this amazing webinar. I'm more interested and excited to have and to participate in this classes. Each one of us is eager to enjoy this session. I don't have a question, but I have a wish, and I hope to achieve it. It's my glad to share with another session, inshallah, in sooner with Dr. Daniel to benefit from a sophisticated knowledge about research, especially those in English language teaching.
Thank you, Yasmin, for your positive feedback on my talk. Thanks so much.
We hope so. I mean, if time allows, hopefully we'll host Prof. Xerri again, time dependent. So we'll thank you, Yasmin, for your feedback. Any other comments or George, you had a comment or a question? Please go ahead.
Thank you. Professor Xerri, thank you so much. That was a fantastic session.
Thank you.
I just wanted to, in response to your so comprehensive point about tailoring what you produce to the journal you might publish in, to just reiterate gently a little bit about brief encounters, because it bears upon particularly Ruba's question about flexibility. So for those of you wanting to express your interest in writing a research article by June 30th for Brief Encounters, but after that you perhaps learn a new research method, or you might have an experience that changes the research question you had when you expressed your interest, please know that from our perspective that's very valuable. This is because Brief Encounters is meant for researchers who are still developing their professional identity, like Millie and I. So what we publish is early stage, or what you might call developing research. It's meant to be a place for you to have an experience of publishing that hopefully develops your confidence. So that's probably the most important thing from our point of view to bear in mind, that there is a degree of flexibility. And because the topic that the special issue focuses on is pedagogical resilience within the English department at Al-Aqsa, the process you are doing now at this very moment is part of what we hope the special issue will reflect. So it's just maybe to bear in mind that we know you are both preparing, hopefully, for publication at the same time as you are still gaining your research skills, which is something Millie and I are doing too. So just to remind you that we have flexibility and we seek to reflect that experience that you are partaking in. I hope that was clear.
Yeah, thank you, George. And that's relevant and encouraging as well for students. You still have a month or so, and after that deadline, you still have the opportunity to send your contribution to the journal. So don't feel like that's the deadline. I missed that chance. No, hopefully it's open. Yeah, it's. Prof. Xerri, if you don't mind, one last comment from my side. Now, when you talked about action research, you talked about how we can put it in a logical way instead of a chronological manner, like logical order instead of time or chronological order. If you can just give a simple kind of example from classroom-based example to exemplify what you mean by logical, not chronological.
I think I was referring to that when I was talking about writing up your research. So rather than merely focusing on a chronological approach, you might think of a structure that makes most sense in packaging the narrative that you'd like to share with your audience. Now, obviously, different journals have different expectations, and they are also being produced for different audiences, but a logical way would be a means by which you help the reader to make sense of what you're talking about in a very coherent manner. So it might be that you first tell them about the problem that you encountered in your classroom. What was the nature of this problem? Why did you feel that it was a big problem that you were facing and that it was impacting your teaching, it was impacting your learners? Then you might then tell them what you sought to do to actually address this problem before telling your reader what ensued from you actually doing an intervention in your classroom. And then talking about your reflections with respect to what was learned. So there, I merely took you through the 4 stages of the action research process. And that is logical in terms of helping the reader understand that you are following a very particular structure that makes sense for people who are familiar with action research, but might not necessarily be merely a narrative account. There might be elements of a narrative account in the way we write up our action research, but at the same time, the structure or the stages of the action research process are the means by which you are structuring your narrative. I don't know whether that
it does
answers
answer
your question or not, Ahmed.
Yeah, it does. It does. Thank you so much. One last question, if you have any question, any comment?
Perhaps one comment related to what George mentioned earlier. It's great for me to see a journal like this that is inviting multiple ways or different ways of writing about research. This is very welcome. It's refreshing to see, because what ends up happening to practitioners is that they always think that when they want to write about the research, the classroom research, they have to do it in the way that academics typically do it. And that is something else which discourages teachers from actually sharing what they've learned from the messy process of doing research. So it's great to see a journal like this doing something very courageous and going against the flow.
Thank you, Professor Xerri. It's really helpful to hear you articulate it like that, because I think I forget that it's a creative process, and we're asking people to partake in shaping what the field looks like as well. So yeah, thank you for affirming that.
And well done on doing that, actually. It's great to see.
It is, yeah, great. Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, George. And look, I think it was planned for 1 hour and it's over 2 hours now, but it feels like we are learning a lot every single minute. Once again, I would like to thank you, Daniel, Prof. Xerri, for your time and effort. And in fact, amid this time and amid the crisis, students feel empowered when they feel that people like you, like George, like Millie, and other experts in the field talk to them and like allocate some time for them to guide them through such processes of research, of teaching, of learning, how to become a better learner, better individual. Indeed, it's a good opportunity to have you with us today. Thank you so much for your time. And thanks for the students, because I really understand how difficult it is to get connected in Gaza, to get internet connection. Some of the attendees, I understand, just like myself, are in public place to get connected. They go to an internet cafe to get connected to the internet. And this is the status quo in Gaza. Just in order to charge your device, in order to get connected, you have to go to a public place. And many of my students, I understand, do this on a daily basis. So apologies if there was any noise in the background. Thank you so much for your understanding, and thanks for this. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for having me, and I wish you the best of luck with your research and with the writing as well. And I hope you find the courage to actually share what you're learning from this process with the rest of the world.
Yeah, thank you so much. I hope so. Thank you, everyone. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.